Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Des Moines, Iowa, here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Wonderful to have you with us. Like I said, my name's Bo Bonner. I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do at the old place?
So I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
And it's important to say all of that because Mercy College of Health Sciences underwrites our show. Thank you, mchs.edu, for doing that. If you are interested in extending the healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy through nursing, through allied health programs, through all sorts of ways that you can be that faithfulness towards people on the ground in need, then you want to go check us out. mchs.edu, again, underwriting our show. Bud, over at the old desk as a dean, you got any insights that you want to throw out to the people?
I would say, you want to master those basic skills, regardless of where you're at in life. Math always comes in handy, and reading as well. But at Mercy, these are excellent subjects for us. I like a lot what's going on here.
The liberal arts are so important. Luella D'Amico, she was talking about studies are starting to show that right around the time modern contemporary kiddos start not going to church or, having questions about God and all that, right around the time that they're seeing that most kids stop reading. And you start to see, right, they just came out with an article, I think in the Atlantic, where they said there's high schoolers that will graduate without reading a complete book. And so she was making this point. The reason that she thinks there's some sort of more than a correlation with this is not so much like, oh, if you read, you believe things, but this something akin to like attention and prayer. And so I think it's interesting, as much as people go, oh, the liberal arts, people throw that out.
Yeah.
But I think it's a matter of a certain cast of mind, like Newman says, to be attentive and to attend to the world and reality. And I'm hoping that's something that Mercy College of Health Sciences, by staying committed to the liberal arts in the middle of a professional school, at least pays homage to if we don't knock it out of the park.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like an old fogey, like shaking my fist at the kids from my back porch or something, but or front porch should probably be. But I think that's right. And, it's tough because in our society, like those opportunities for cultivating attentiveness are kind of going the wayside. I mean, there's a lot of distractions in place that can draw our attention elsewhere. Back in history, like sacred art and the liturgy and these things, like they were a way for a lot of people, even the illiterate, to enter into the faith. But these days, like, because there's not some of that structure there, or like that, we're drawn away from it quite a bit. I do think hopefully what the liberal arts imparts can be sort of like a preparation for the gospel, or hearing it well.
Precisely, just by saying there's things that are worth considering on their own and they don't need to have an immediate function.
This intro got deep. Usually we're like joking about pumpkin spice.
That's true.
Talking baseball.
The only thing I'll bring up to like lighten it up a bit is I got to do the morning show this last week, and one of the news items was, do you remember when they said you shouldn't cut your grass at certain times? You should let weeds grow.
Yeah.
So that bees. And so I was like, great, because I hate mowing. Well, now they're saying you shouldn't pick up your leaves because like worms and bugs need it. And I'm like, you only had to tell me once. And so now when my neighbors are getting mad, I'm going to be like, the government told me, and I'm just being St. Francis of Assisi.
It was funny. In Windsor Heights last summer, there was the Don't Mow movement. Yeah. And somebody actually started printing, like we've got the political signs this year. Yeah. There were signs with some clever statement about, or a clever phrase to like justify the non-mowing. Yeah. Windsor Heights, like when we get worked up about things, whether it's sidewalks or cutting your grass, it gets pretty intense.
Well, look, man, you don't need a sign for me. The minute, if you need me to not mow, not pick up leaves, not take out the trash, I'm there for everyone. So, So we're going to be actually talking about not trash. Don't worry about it. We're going to be talking about the dignity of the human person and its fundamental nature in Catholic social teaching. So this is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us, whether that is through the Iowa Catholic area airwaves, on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, iowacatholicradio.com, or all our beautiful podcast listeners. We keep rolling along with our 8-year celebration. Way back then, 8 years ago, which in 2020-esque terms seems like 40 years ago. We had 30-minute shows. We had to get to topics quick, but we were going through the principles of Catholic social teaching. And, Bud, I'll be honest to the old audience out there, we really sort of, at this point in the first run, stopped, or we kind of pivoted, right? We started doing a few interviews and things like this, and the interviews alighted upon Catholic social teaching pretty strictly for a while. But if you're just talking about that first run, we started pivoting a bit more and tossing in Catholic social principles as we went along. For this one, we wanted to hit, so to speak, all the ones that you would usually see anywhere. There's sort of a typical 7. That 7 has sort of changed a bit and morphed. Language-wise, you might see different versions of it. There's essentially 7. There's more terms involved, and so if you go back a little further and you get books talking about Catholic social teaching or the encyclical tradition, they really will sort of tease out even more stuff like that. I think that's why we started, for instance, with peace and justice, which you might not see, for instance, if you go on the USCCB website and put in principles of Catholic social teaching. But one we wanted to do today, which we didn't catch the first time through, I think we were sort of addressing it by some of the first people we were interviewing. But essential to Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person. Now, Bud, out of the gate, one of the ways that it's usually listed first anymore, and it makes sense to say, right? Like, because if we don't appreciate the dignity of the human person, it seems like anything like peace or justice or subsidiarity or all those things like that are going to start to maybe be, they'll miss the mark if we don't get the dignity of the human person down pat. And so it's important to say, it makes sense that most people talk about this one first, even if we chose to talk about some more fundamental, or at least in theoretically theoretical principles first. But I will say that the dignity of the human person in some ways gets flattened even by the people trying to defend it, because I think they have a very politicized idea about what that means. Now, it is certainly the case that the political elements, the sort of elements of Catholic social teaching that sort of the rubber hits the road with political issues, dignity of the human person plays a huge role. But I do think it helps stepping back a little to ask what we mean by dignity and how it might play a little weird in the common parlance. Before we get there, Bud, when you think of the dignity of the human person, where are you encountering it? Where do you hear other people talking about it?
Well, I mean, for starters, and I'm dodging your question a bit, it's so foundation to both like the scriptural worldview, but also Catholic theology. So Genesis famously starts with this kind of affirmation of the Imago Dei, the image of God. And I think historically, it was really revolutionary the way that Christianity thought about this. So this is channeling a bit of David Bentley Hart, an author, his book, Atheist Delusions. Like, I think in our day and age, we forget just how transformative, like, the Christian understanding of some of this is. There's an example that he uses in that book that really jumped out to me where, you know, after Peter betrays our Lord, he goes away and he's grief-stricken and crying. And David Bentley Hart says, like, this is the first time, like, in human literature that there's this kind of fixation on the tears of a peasant. Now, I mean, we don't want to overstate this fact. So, of course, like the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, like in ancient Israeli culture, the culture of the Israelites, it of course is a huge thread like throughout the Old Testament. But if you compare that with like other ancient Near Eastern cultures, like this idea that like this special care for the poor, that someone's dignity or worth is not related to their strength or their social position or their sort of practicality or like what they can contribute to society. I mean, that's truly revolutionary. Now, in our day and age, it gets batted around in different ways. I'm not sure where to head with your question. For some reason, I'm kind of drawing a blank here.
Well, I think in modern political thought, we dignity of the human person will get brought up by both political sides. So pro-life sides obviously talking about the dignity of the unborn child, the dignity of an older person, the dignity of someone who is under a massive amount of pains and is being pointed. People are pointing to assisted death, things like this. That the dignity of the human person is primary. You also get this in what would be sort of coded, as it were, more left or liberal politics, right? The dignity of immigrants, the dignity of the poor, the dignity of women, right? So dignity is thrown out as a watchword, rightfully so, because it touches on so much in the political arena. What I want to bring up, though, and this was brought to my attention by my friend Yves Tushnet, who pointed out that the word dignity, the further back you go, the less it sounds like what we usually use as Christians, and in many ways the Christianity put into modern parlance, because the oldest, I think the word dignitary actually predates the general use of dignity. Now, of course, I'm going to make a distinction here. You're absolutely right that we go back and say, well, look, man was created in the image, woman was created in the image of God, the Imago Dei is there. Clearly, what we call dignity now, humans have always had, even if we disrespect it or not. But the terminology, the idea of dignity being the central way of talking about that, relatively late to the game. Dignitary, or dignitas from Latin, was reserved for nobles. And this, I think, David Bentley's Hart's point is relevant here. It's almost carnivalesque, bud. It's almost like Christianity turned the term on its head, because dignity used to be the thing dignitaries had, and dignitaries were noble people, and people who weren't noble, was questionable whether they had dignity or not. If they had it, it was sort of like a spillover from the dignity of the nobleman. So if you were good peasants, or you were a good slave or servant, or the closer you lived to a nobleman or a noblewoman, you had more dignity. It was a thing that sort of could be granted or lost. You could have more of it or not. We have it now where we go, no, dignity is something everyone has, right? They have it by nature of being a human, and they have it by nature because as a human, we all have the image of God within us. And that animates then why political arguments try to get to this concept of dignity. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at is, if we look to the past, it's almost like Christianity on purpose took a term that was considered aristocratic and reserved for a few, and the radicality was saying everyone has it by nature of just being a human. And it really took many centuries for that to be threaded deeply into a society where you could get to 2024, and no matter on what side of a political debate you're on, you're trying to say you care about dignity and your opponent doesn't. That is quite a transformation, and that to me is a history that most people don't pay attention to, and I think that flattens out the argument about dignity.
It seems to me that we're in kind of a complicated place today, and what I mean by that, so I'm even going to draw on like a Catholic document here, like at Vatican II, there's this famous treatment of religious liberty, religious freedom. And that document, in Dignitatis Humanae, again, the language of dignity, it starts by saying that a sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man. I think in recent documents, when the church has treated capital punishment, it's kind of made that claim as well, that like in recent times, there's been a stronger sense of the dignity of each person. Mm-hmm. And like you're pointing out, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, there tends to be this kind of claim that that's like your fundamental like driving point or whatever. Like everyone sort of wants to be on the side of dignity.
Right.
Where it gets complicated. And I think even with like what like the bishops of Vatican II are saying there, in some ways I see what they're saying. Like, I think with the development, especially like in Western philosophy, around conversations around the topic of like human rights and the universality of these rights, like I see what they're seeing. On the other hand, it seems like in our society today, we've also become very clever at kind of ignoring or overlooking the dignity of those who are, I guess we have a way of like occluding the dignity of certain persons. So an obvious example would be the unborn. Mm-hmm. So for instance, you go to abortion debates and there's this language of like my body, my choice, not recognizing that another human body is present. Regular listeners of Iowa Catholic Radio will be shaking their heads, yes. But I mean, if you want to point like a finger back at us in some ways, like think about the treatment of the elderly in our society, like sort of pushed to the margins. Again, we tend to approach these questions in very utilitarian terms, where those who are valued or upheld or worth defending, like they still have something to contribute. But we can kind of like marginalize those who don't have a voice to speak for themselves.
And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is the reason it's important to say everybody really wants to claim now that they have dignity, but if you go far enough back in the human past, it was only reserved for a few. And another set of terms that I want to bring up, we talk a lot about human rights now. It's sort of in the air. It's very natural if you're going to talk about justice and social justice to talk about human rights. But actually, rights language, very contested, and actually you have people in the church sort of being on both sides of the issue, not that humans don't have rights like how we're largely saying them, but worried that if we use that language, we're actually sort of giving up too much of the field to the opposition of Christianity. We don't have time to unpack like the entire history of why human rights, especially in France after the Revolution, the French Revolution, would make people queasy. But I do think it's important to pause sometimes. Like if you go to the social compendium of Catholic social teaching, it will just straight out talk about human dignity and human rights. And it's also even true that the Catholic Church in a lot of its debates, especially someone like Jacques Maritain, that they were very influential when like the UN made their declaration on human rights. My only point is to say they're not exactly the same thing. And the reason they're not is very important. So if you press too much that humans have dignity and human rights stem from being a human, and you have no theology behind that, it gets exactly to the utilitarianism that you're pointing out. Because now what's the ground for the debate, bud? Who's a human? And if humans can all have dignity and human rights, good. But let's like start policing who is considered a human. And what has the very modern world, let's not like put this far in the past, the modern world that started talking about human rights, but what were they doing simultaneous as they were talking about human rights? They enslaved entire races of people. They became comfortable killing groups of people. Some people didn't deserve to have the franchise. And then, I mean, in nowadays, right, we think about abortion. We think about euthanasia. We think about what's considered mercy killing. And we start to have these debates, right, that, oh, well, they're not human yet, or what makes them human has gone away, like their memories have gone, or pain somehow has invalidated the worthiness of their life. And so it's very important to say, whose rights are we talking about? If you stay in the liberal Enlightenment understanding of human rights, so not liberal, conservative like the political parties, the modern theory of liberal Enlightenment, if you stay only within their conception of human rights, that is literally the ethical contest, who is human or not, and we have come to very gross violations of justice when having that debate. And I say we because it's very modern groups of people that we're all connected to. You don't have to go back to very long in the past to see we have flagrantly gone against this. And what I want to say is it's something to the effect of we're not afraid enough, as it were, to violate the rights of others. What is important, right, when you talk about rights going into the past is they actually stem from obligations first. Like, actually, if you look at Western conceptions of law, obligations come first, and the people who are obligated, what are they obligated by? Well, the right someone has to their obligation. And what you'll often see is rulers have obligations. So this is where the sort of nobleness and dignity starts to trickle outward sort of naturally. The idea is you can be like a lord and you can have serfs. This is like, a long time ago, the Middle Ages. However, you have obligations to the people who are your serfs. Now, they abuse it all the time. I'm not trying to act like this is golden age. I'm just making the point legally. You have obligations toward your serfs before you have rights from them. You can demand, yes, this idea that like they give you part of their crop, but that's because you are supposed to be their leader and take care of them and actually defend them. Did people do this? No. There's all sorts of people who violated it. I'm not trying to get at like a nostalgic take here. I'm trying to say that if you believe obligations start first, and then you can start to see that people have rights that you are obligated towards, especially if you're powerful, that's a very different way to look at human rights. So human rights is not just this thing that emanates from humans deciding it. It really is this idea of if you have been given a role in the social order, you have obligations to protect the rights of others. But even more so, Bud, the most important right, and a lot of this actually comes from discussions about, like you brought up, like the religious wars and like who, what's the right that princes have over people's obligations to religion and worship. God's right is what actually drives Western discussions of humans' rights. Why can't you violate people? Because they are all the children of God and his image is in them. And continually, when in the modern world, as people are more and more violating entire groups of people, saying just because you were born a slave or you're African or you're black or whatever we say, that you don't have the rights or the capacity, Native Americans, indigenous people everywhere. The arguments were, oh, well, they're not us, so we don't have to grant them rights. And the people who stood against this time and time again said, no, you're violating God's right because they're his people. They have the image of God within them. He has made them. They're his children. You have no right to do what you're doing. Indeed, you have an obligation towards them, and you're violating it. That is a very different take on human rights and thus human dignity that demands a theological grounding, or I think we spill into all of this bad blood that has occurred through history.
Yeah, I think with what you're saying there, it's part of the reason why Scripture, with its ethical directives, always kind of intertwines the divine with the human. I know, like, when people talk about the Decalogue or 10 Commandments, they say, like, there are some of them that are vertical related and then horizontal. But really, with the way that the Decalogue is structured, it starts foundationally with our relationship to God. Mm-hmm. So hallowing the divine name, making the Sabbath holy, setting it apart for the adoration of God. And I think that works in a couple ways. One is, like, if you don't have that human divine relationship worked out rightly, what you're saying is like what we owe God by virtue of who God is, then the horizontal will be all out of whack. But related to that, the horizontal, you could also describe it as like a barometer of our relationship with God. So there is this kind of propensity of human beings to deceive themselves and say, like, well, I worship or I do the right rituals, but, and then to overlook or mistreat their neighbor, like as they leave church or whatnot. Whereas I'm probably a broken record on this one, but with the sheep and the goats in the New Testament, Christ is saying what we do on behalf of those in need, like we're actually in that very act relating to God. The tough part of this whole thing for me, Bo, is like, I think one sort of like thrust for our show is to be anti-utilitarian, but it really requires a commitment that's willing to sort of damn the torpedoes and to be, you have to flip your mindset, because I think to go about life in this way just requires an extraordinary amount of sacrifice. And I look at someone like Mother Teresa, like in the world's eyes, or St. Vincent de Paul. I mean, we could go down the line, Francis of Assisi. To live in that way is just highly inefficient, according to the world's terms. But with those figures, what they recognize is that the gifts of God, they're not scarce. They don't run out. It's just like in the Eucharist. It's like we could stop the communion line and say, like, there's no more of Jesus to go around. Like, Mother Teresa operated in such a way that she believed that God had given her all the time necessary, that's like that she could be with those who were dying, who were like direly in need. The temptation, and I think like for someone like, okay, so for myself, like who's part of the managerial class, is like we say like, well, if I stop doing what I'm doing, then the world's not going to be able to run. And we get in this mindset like we either have to like fix things or save things. Again, in saying all this, I'm not calling people to be lazy, but like that verse, be still and know that I am God. Probably the one way, like maybe the primary way to begin to like recognize that and see the truth of that verse is to say, I'm going to stop telling myself that like this institution or this society or structure is dependent on me, like working myself to the bone. And I'm going to be inefficient in the world's terms so that I can become closer to God.
Yeah. So in some ways, exactly the verse, the Sabbath was made for man and not the man for Sabbath. That sort of idea. I think it's a good place to take a pause. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are talking about the Catholic social principle of human dignity, the dignity of the human person, to be more exact. And then maybe, if I've seen it rendered also, human dignity and human rights. So we've been talking about, I think of all of them, we're trying to say dignity and like the sort of history of where it comes up in church parlance is important. Justice, peace, these are things that the ancients of nearly any culture have been talking about. Rendering the talk about why the human person is important as dignity, that certainly has a sort of progress throughout time, particularly the idea that it's universal, that it applies to all people. But there's simply no way to look back in history and say that that was obvious for most of it. This is an achievement. And for people who say nothing ever changes, I don't see how you can argue that it wasn't Christianity, as much as they failed the concept again and again, being chock full of sinners, as we say, wasn't the group that got this discussion started about the universal dignity of the human person. The social compendium keeps talking about personalism as a sort of unique Catholic contribution to the debate about social issues, but particularly in this idea about human dignity. Personalism, it really depends on what you mean. So just to be honest, that if you're not familiar with sort of more academic terms, personalism can mean a lot of things depending on which field you're talking about. I think that's a safe way to say it. What they're getting at is the idea that the human person takes precedence over other social considerations. That's what they're calling this sort of personalism. And it goes back to the Imago Dei. That's the theological root of this, right? What makes you a person? And it's the image of God. And if you have the image of God, anything else, so to speak, must be used instrumentally towards you and not you instrumentally towards them. Funny enough, this is sort of a convergence, I would say, of Thomistic and Augustinian and many strands of Christian ethics, of course, like from the Old Testament and the New. But this is one thing where I think we kind of took from Immanuel Kant one of his statements, even if like his defense of why he thinks it, ultimately the church, I would say, didn't take. I know there's Kantian Catholics out there. I guess we can fight. We can have an argument. But he made this idea that humans have to be considered ends in themselves. He then, of course, if you actually read everything else he says, has very insane ideas about how that doesn't apply to everyone. Exactly. So, I mean, like he's a very complicated figure. But this statement, right, that to be ethical means to treat someone as an end in themselves. They can be useful also, but they must be treated as an end in themselves. Catholic theology says that's exactly right, but it's not because of this, like, they have rationality or some of the sort of Enlightenment appeals that Kant makes. What they say is because they're made in the image of God. And because they're made in the image of God, they must be treated as ends in themselves and not instrumentally for other purposes, like the economy, like a war, like civilization building, or even good things, right? They must be treated as ends in themselves, and that's because God has the right over them. It is God's right to intervene and say, these are my beloved children, and you can't treat them like playthings, because I don't even do that. And so if that's the case, that is the grounding of this personal dignity that has taken centuries to articulate, but has now become the fundamental ground of any sort of Catholic social argument that we are making on behalf of anyone.
As we've talked about these topics the last several weeks, I hope our listeners have caught just how, I think you may have used the language of pillars of Catholic social teaching, so just how foundational these are. And really, I would say Catholic social teaching is almost like a superstructure where you have to have all of the elements for it to have a kind of harmony. And if you pull one piece out, for whatever reason you do so, like the entire edifice falls to the ground. So if you don't understand the nature of human dignity and honor it consistently, this is, I think, where you run into real trouble with ethics, and especially like bioethics. And, C.S. Lewis at one point, he said like the worst kind of dictator is the one who like assumes he's acting on behalf of the good of his, like who goes about his tyranny on behalf of the good of his subjects, And really a lot of times, like even sometimes in talking with my students and things, some of the most heinous, like bioethical mistakes that we make are out of like driven by a false compassion. And so again, like this is such a key pillar, but it's also related in so many ways with, like, last week we talked about marriage and the family. Sometimes we want to start with like our activism, our pet causes, and not get those foundational pieces right. So sometimes, I think with more progressive Catholics, they'll really be concerned about economic injustices, but they maybe lose the foundation when it comes to marriage and family or something like that. And without that piece, all that, like, you go back to Leo the 13th, what he's saying about the economy doesn't make sense unless you get the other part right. Mm-hmm. In the same way, I think for Catholics more to the right, like, they maybe see the importance and the fundamental character of the church's teaching on marriage, but then, like, they sort of ignore the ways that free market capitalism can, frankly, like, corrode what we're trying to accomplish in that sphere. And so all of this hangs together, and it's important to see, like, the cohesiveness there.
I think you bringing it up that way, an interesting way to think about all of this, rather than, the Catholic has to choose now one party, now another, in order to consider human dignity and stay true to it, or the rest of the Catholic social teaching principles. In many ways, Bud, the question is about what you reason from and what you reason towards. And I think this is the biggest sort of disconnect we have. We believe we reason from these principles, and then we reason towards what the problem might be, and that's when we actually have to be practical and prudent. I know sometimes when people hear about, like, you have these ideals, but then, hey, you have to make all these compromises. And you go, that's not quite what we're saying either. What we're saying is that if we have an obligation towards human dignity, the dignity of human persons, because they are made in the image of God, and so already it's a religious obligation towards the dignity of human persons. So forget the fact that I'm talking to Catholics right now, right? Plenty of people in whatever polity you're in might not believe that, but we do. We believe that these people have abstract rights, right? That because they're running around as humans, even though that's technically true. We're saying something much stronger. Because these are creatures made in the image of God, you and me, have an obligation towards them, and it's a religious one. God says, if you would be just and right to me, if you will give me the worship and due I am owed, you must treat your brother as yourself. You must treat your sister as yourself. You must believe in this solidarity and subsidiarity of humanity because of the dignity, my dignity as God, is stamped on every human person. So if that's the case, when we start talking about rights and obligations, we're obligated to say these folks have the right to have that dignity shine forth, Bud. And so now it's not that we need to be, we have to totally subscribe to sort of one economic theory or another. It's not like football where, you're like, well, I cheer for the secondary of the Chicago Bears, but I cheer for the line of the Packers. Like, that would be weird, right? You're like, you choose one team or you don't. No, where we can get practical and prudent and pick and choose is the economic theories, right? What we have to be obligated is the dignity of the human person. And so if we try to do something even for like 5 years, we try and this aspect of an economic plan, Bud, and we as Catholics go, it does not respect the dignity of the human person, we should be willing to throw that in the garbage, because our team that we need to choose is team human dignity. We'll use everything else as instruments, but instead, Bud, we'll act like the theories are intrinsic and that people are instruments to either prove the theory right or fit into the theory. And if they don't fit into the theory, then move them to the side. That, to me, is what we are missing and getting exactly backwards when it comes to the debates about the primacy of the dignity of the human person versus whatever this, that, or the other political thing we might try to do.
As we've been talking about all this, I think the church being prophetic in this regard, and then also not simply prophetic in its preaching, but in how it lives out its weekly life. This is, I'm somewhat allergic to the language of the new evangelization because it's been used so often, and
it's kind of old now at this point. You didn't hear me say that.
Well, I'm getting old, and so maybe I'll start talking about it more. But when we think about evangelizing or giving witness in the world, I think this is the primary, like one of the primary ways of doing so. Now, but like to preface this next point, we have to be careful because again, it can be turned into one more like utilitarian consideration. But the temptation when we talk about evangelization is so often to pivot to slick marketing. And you and I, like, we can be upfront about this because we're prone to it. I mean, we work for a college where like one of the primary ways it recruits folks is through using like internet searches to make these connections and things like that.
Right.
We have a radio show that we want people to listen to, and it's not going to get.
No, we're just, listen or not, folks.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
It's your choice.
Of course.
Yeah. And so we're trying to find these ways, and really, so often the only way you can do so is through the means that the world has provided. This might go back to the parable of like the children of this world being like slicker than the people of God. I know I totally just butchered that verse.
Yeah.
But
I believe that was the King James version.
Yeah, that's right. So this isn't a utilitarian consideration. It is about faithfulness. But at the end of the day, I think if we're serious about the new evangelization, it's really going to spark or spread like wildfire if we're willing to stick our necks out in this regard. And in saying that, I think back to the work of our good friend Mike Aquilina. He's written some great books on how like Christianity spread like in the first few decades and first centuries after Christ. And it was in a lot of ways because the first Christians were, unlike their neighbors, they were totally committed to taking care of their newborns regardless of their health staff. They took care of the widows and orphans. And through that act, they created a revolution. And we have to, like, I think we're kind of entering those sort of circumstances again, and that has to be a part of our witness in the world.
No, I think that's a great way to put this. And this goes back to what we said in the first segment. Dignity was not always this obvious universal thing that many of the cultures throughout history thought everyone had. Dignity, one more time, was for dignitaries, right? Dignitas was for noble people. And the poor could sort of maybe get in the orbit of dignity, but it wasn't usually afforded to them. When God himself, right, the noblest of all noble things, becomes incarnate, the second person of the Trinity becomes incarnate as Jesus Christ and becomes incarnate as a poor man, someone who is not immediately born into a kingly family, by blessing in his flesh poverty, which we can talk about in a later episode about what that means to bless poverty. When Jesus did that, he turned this normal system of dignity on its head. And eventually, I mean, the church from the very beginning, making this point, but then sophisticated enough, says everyone deserves dignity. And precisely as you say, look to our history and look how we were providing dignity for people that first of all, regarding them as people, first of all, and then giving them dignity in regarding their dignity and paying attention to their dignity in a way no one did. So like exposed babies in Rome, for instance. I mean, like this is a very obvious one. This is why the abortion debate is so central to the heart of the church throughout the years, is central to our identity, is those abandoned babies that were left to the elements to die. We raised them, and the choirs of those early churches, Bud, were filled with people that others thought had no dignity. And we, in a revolutionary way, disagreed. And we showed that through our actions. Now, we're in the part of the world in history where linguistically we have like a good problem to have, but it has dire consequences. You know how people go like, oh, it's a good problem to have when there's not enough parking at your church because everybody's going to the services. Well, what I think we've done, Bud, is we have sort of given the concept of dignity such airplay, and that everybody now says they need to figure out how to say what they're arguing for is actually giving people dignity, that now we have people saying death with dignity, but what they mean is euthanasia, which isn't dignifying, right? We need to talk about that. They'll talk about like Catholics don't respect the dignity of women's autonomy when they're getting into arguments actually about abortion or actually things that are far more invasive to human health and women's health than they're letting on. They'll say that we're violating the dignity of when we talk about sexual ethics and what's best for people. What I'm getting at is it's certainly the case that there's always going to be a temptation when we've been given something great, like the Christian moral teachings, to use it as a way to exclude people and to injure their dignity. But it's also important for us to say, in boldness, we have to say, we've created this good problem, bud. Dignity is on the tongue of basically every ethical theory that has now come after Christian ethics ruled supreme in the West. Everybody talks about human dignity.
Yeah.
But that means that they're going to mislabel it. And what we can't allow ourselves to ever act like is, no, actually, we're against dignity. We have to be willing to clarify what that means. And it starts with, like you said, us caring about the poor, the littlest, the smallest, orphans, widows, fetuses, people who've lost their memory, people in great pain, et cetera, et cetera.
I love those parts of the liturgy that talk about how by assuming our humanity, Christ shared with us his divinity, and how he elevated our humanity through the incarnation. This is where as theologians, we have to make the necessary distinctions, because the world, qua world, it's created good and it has a dignity of its own. So I know, like, especially in Eastern liturgies, there's this like blessing of the waters. And so as we care for all of creation, like that's part of our witness and our call as Christians. But there is something special about human nature, and that the Son of God precisely assumed that. And so, like, seeing that kind of dignity, like it's funny because it upends. You were talking about like dignitaries and the kind of like honor that was bestowed on royalty in all sorts of cultures in previous eras. Like we are made sons and daughters of God, and those who are baptized and drawn up into the divine life, they take on a royalty that sometimes like the world doesn't see. Mm-hmm. But I still go back to like the danger of the ways that sometimes like dignity is used, and you've used the language of common parlance, and so like death with dignity and things, and this kind of like false compassion that takes place. And that's where, like, when we think about the royalty that God bestows upon his children, like the dignity, I think, of those who are sick and dying is kind of the hardest for us to make sense of and to talk with others about. I know I think about our experience teaching bioethics with undergrads, and sometimes like with the pro-life cause, we have more traction there than we do when we talk about controversial issues like euthanasia, because it's hard to see meaning and purpose there. But I know in talking to brothers and sisters in Christ who I greatly admire, who have faced serious illness or who have journeyed alongside a loved one who died, there's a way in which they have come to a deeper understanding of what it means to identify with Christ and conform to Christ that you can't understand apart from suffering. And I'm not trying to like sentimentalize or make suffering like put a sheen on it. Like there is, like, it is a part of the reality of sin and the structures of sin. And yet Christ even entered that space and redeemed it and brought it up to the divine life, and such that, like, again, like we can, I think, only fully understand what it means to be like Christ by going through that.
Yeah, and if that's when it gets down to, right, the royalty, I love how you keep pressing that, the royalty of the poor, of the poverty, of illness, of these things, it can sound perverse, right? It can sound like we're some sort of weird death cult that really celebrates people not getting better. But what I think I think it's a rhetorical trick to say that, bud. Because then you go, oh, hey, by the way, if we're wrong and there is no God and there is no Christianity, people get sick and die anyway, man. What are you going to do with this? It's true that what we don't want to do is romanticize it and act like you should be seeking out your own martyrdom or seeking out to get sick. That is perverse, granted. Anything good is capable of being perverted by humans. That's like one of the things we're best at, is messing up good stuff. But what we want to say is, if God himself chose the royal road of suffering to, and this goes back to these other principles, right, bud? To show solidarity with humanity, to give the sort of power of subsidiarity, that he thinks that our flesh and our history matters enough to live a human life in order to show this dignity, that the royalty of need, it goes back to, it's priestly, bud, right? Like, we're not going to go to heaven. None of us are going to go to heaven unless we help our brothers and sisters. I mean, we don't have to believe in works righteousness like Protestants will accuse us of this. This is just what, like, you have to in some way. Maybe it's through prayer. Maybe you're a hermit and you never talk to another human. But you have to have charity towards the image of God and others, or you won't even like heaven, right? You won't even want to go if you don't have charity for the image of God and others. The sick, the poor, the needy, children, small people, old people, people that need us, they are giving us the chance to have charity in our heart. So the royal dignity they have is they are offering us the road to God. This goes back to when we talk about, like, there's two altars to God. One is the altar of the mass, and the other is the altar of the hands of the poor and those in need. Their dignity is we don't go to heaven without their need. And in turn, when we are in need, and all of us will be, all of us, our dignity is in our neediness. The fact that we are in need and others come to aid us, we think like, oh, we get shamed, like, I'm so ashamed that I had to ask for help. No, brothers and sisters, you now have become the occasion for charity in the soul of someone else. There is no higher dignity than being the cause of someone's charity and conversion in their heart that gets them into heaven. And Bud, that, like you said, is the radical nature of what we mean by the dignity of the human person that stands out against the, let's be frank, the latecomers up to the block of secular humanism and their understanding of human rights and human dignity. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us, whether you are listening through the Iowa Catholic airwaves in central Iowa, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our wonderful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I hope we dignified the listeners as persons by delving into the subject today.
I think I wounded my own dignity during the show because if I sound funny, I took a sip of tea as we were talking, and I'm paying the price. It's like when you put it in these travel mugs that are built to keep in the heat. Like normally, the drink will cool down just by exposure to air. But man, that was an atomic bomb on my tongue there.
I just love that we're like calling out the cooler industry as being against the dignity of humanity. Yeah, well, you know what we'll never mask is the power of prayer.
The power of prayer. Please join us in our prayer life at Iowa Catholic Radio. So we pray the rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 p.m. So got all parts of the day covered. Also a very specific time for the Chaplet of Divine Mercy these days, 3:56 in the afternoon. But if you ever forget, or if you're very mobile and on the move, you can just grab the Iowa Catholic Radio app and use it to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
On the iowacatholicradio.com events page. So November 1st in West Des Moines, Iowa Catholic Radio, the First Friday Mass. November 8th in West Des Moines, Man Up Power, West Power Lunch. Father Matthew Luft of St. Pius X is going to share his experience from a recently completed pilgrimage to Lourdes, Fatima, and the Camino de Santiago. So lunch provided. November 16th at the Valley Community Center, Born to Run 5K and 1 mile fun run. And then finally start thinking ahead during Lent of this upcoming Lent, April 2nd, 2025, an evening with Father Mike Schmitz. The Iowa Catholic Radio Network invites you to an evening with Father Mike Schmitz as we embark on our 20th year of connecting listeners to Christ and his church, wherever they may be on their faith journey. Sign up today to be notified when tickets go on sale. And just a note, right, that's not going to be like a big celebration. It's going to be in the Lenten spirit, but not only of thinking of, charity and fasting and prayer, but, that sort of almsgiving towards the station so that we can keep on keeping on, hopefully for another 20 years and beyond. But of course, I hope that calls to mind that this can't happen. This ministry is not just the people behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well, and it doesn't happen without your time, talent, and treasure. We thank you for your prayers, your volunteer opportunities, but we do depend on your donation. So call 515-223-1150 or go to iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app and hit donate and make those donations so that this ministry can stay possible. Bud, wonderful show. burns on your face aside, I feel uplifted and dignified thinking about something that is very key to understanding Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, it's been fun going back to those old episodes, so I hope our listeners are enjoying it as much as we are.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.